It was supposed to be a short layover, 3 hours at most. I was heading home after a business trip, already tired and eager to just get back to my own bed. But when I arrived at the airport, I saw the dreaded words flashing on the departure screen. Flight canceled. I groaned. My flight wasn't the only one affected by the storm rolling in, and the airport was packed with stranded passengers. I made my way to the help desk, only to be told that the earliest flight I could get would be 10 hours later. They gave me a meal voucher and a pat on the back. I was stuck in the airport overnight. At first, it didn't seem too bad. I had my laptop, some work to catch up on, and a few books on my tablet. But as the hours dragged on, the bustling terminal emptied out. People either got rebooked or left to find hotels. It became eerily quiet. Just a few of us remained, those of us unlucky enough to be stuck for the night. Around midnight, I decided to find somewhere more comfortable to rest. The rows of airport chairs were uncomfortable, with their unforgiving armrests. But I figured if I could find a corner or an empty gate, I might be able to stretch out. I wandered the concourses, hearing nothing but the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional echo of my footsteps. That's when I saw him. He was sitting alone at one of the gates, hunched over with his head in his hands. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another stranded passenger, like me. But as I walked past, he lifted his head and stared directly at me. There was something off about him. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face pale and gaunt. It wasn't just the tired look of someone who'd been stuck in an airport for too long. It was like he hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. I gave him a polite nod and kept walking, but I could feel his gaze following me. I found an empty gate a few rows down and sat down, trying to get comfortable. I had just started to drift off when I heard a sound. Footsteps. I opened my eyes and saw him again, standing a few feet away, staring. "Long night, huh?" he said, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, trying to be polite but also feeling uneasy. "Yeah, flight got canceled." "Same here," he said, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just small talk. It felt more like a statement, as if he was trying to make a connection that didn't exist. I forced a smile and closed my eyes again, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. But the footsteps didn't fade away. Instead, they grew louder, closer. When I opened my eyes again, he was sitting directly across from me, leaning forward. His eyes were locked on mine, and he wasn't blinking. "You shouldn't sleep here," he whispered. "You never know who's watching." My heart raced. His words, combined with the unsettling look in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, trying to play it off casually. "Yeah, you're right. Maybe I'll grab some coffee," I said, edging away. He didn't move. He just kept staring, a strange smile creeping onto his face. I hurried away, my skin crawling. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing up, following me at a slow, deliberate pace. I ducked into a coffee shop that was thankfully still open, though empty. I ordered a drink, hoping that by the time I came out, he'd be gone. But when I stepped back into the concourse, he was standing by the gate I'd just left, staring in my direction. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I couldn't stay in one place too long. My stomach twisted with unease, and I decided to head back toward the more populated part of the airport, hoping to find a security guard or at least some other passengers. As I rounded a corner, I saw an airport janitor cleaning the floors. I rushed up to him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, Has anyone reported a creepy guy hanging around? I asked. The janitor looked at me, confused. No, haven't seen anyone but you for a while now. That's when it hit me. Aside from the janitor and the coffee shop worker, I hadn't seen another soul in what felt like hours. When I turned around, the man was gone. I spent the rest of the night in the airport's main terminal, near the security desk, where a few other stranded passengers were gathered. I didn't see the man again, and by morning, the airport was bustling with people once more. When my flight finally boarded, I breathed a sigh of relief, but the entire experience left me shaken. Maybe he was just another weary traveler, but something about him wasn't right. And now, whenever I'm stuck in an airport overnight, I can't help but wonder, who's watching? I was about 8 years old the first time I flew on an airplane. My family was headed to Disney World, and I was beyond excited. We got to the airport early that morning, my mom holding my hand while my dad wrangled our bags. The terminal was packed with people, everyone rushing from one place to another, but I wasn't really paying attention to any of that. I was too busy thinking about Mickey Mouse and roller coasters. We checked in, went through security, and made it to our gate with plenty of time to spare. Since our flight wasn't boarding yet, my dad told us to sit tight while he grabbed snacks. My mom was on the phone with my aunt, discussing plans for our trip. I remember sitting there, swinging my legs back and forth, bored and impatient. That's when I noticed him. A man, sitting a few rows away, looking directly at me. He was older, probably in his 50s, wearing a plain baseball cap and sunglasses even though we were indoors. He didn't look particularly threatening at first, but something about the way he stared made me uncomfortable. I glanced up at my mom, but she was still deep in conversation, paying no attention to anything around us. So, I did what any kid would do. I ignored the man and looked away, trying to focus on something else. But every time I peeked out of the corner of my eye, he was still watching me. After a while, my dad returned with a bag of chips and some drinks. "Here, buddy," he said, handing me a snack. "Eat up before we get on the plane." I tore into the bag, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I looked up again, the man was gone. Relief washed over me, and I started to relax. Maybe he'd just been waiting for his flight. I told myself I was overreacting, just being a nervous kid in a crowded place. But then, as we lined up to board the plane, I saw him again. He was standing near the back of the boarding line, not holding a ticket or a bag, just standing there, his eyes darting between me and my parents. A sinking feeling hit my stomach. I tugged on my mom's sleeve, but she brushed me off, telling me not to worry. "He's probably on the same flight," she said, not even glancing in his direction. We boarded the plane, found our seats, and I tried to focus on my excitement for Disney World. But that gnawing feeling wouldn't go away. I kept looking back at the gate, expecting to see him come down the aisle. But he didn't. He wasn't on the plane. We landed in Orlando without any issue, and I began to forget about the man in the terminal. We were on vacation after all. Time to have fun. But that strange encounter lingered in the back of my mind. The real horror came on the day we were supposed to fly back home. We arrived at the airport early, just like we had before, and went through the usual motions. This time, I was more aware of my surroundings, trying to keep an eye out for any familiar faces in the crowd. I didn't see anyone strange, and for the most part, the trip seemed like it would end without a hitch. But while we were waiting at the gate for our flight, my parents got distracted. My dad went to use the restroom, and my mom went to grab coffee from the kiosk nearby. I was left sitting on the seats alone, swinging my legs again and munching on a candy bar. That's when I heard a voice. "Hey, buddy, you lost?" I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the first airport, the same one who had been watching me. He was standing just a few feet away, holding out a hand, like he expected me to take it. "No, my parents are right over there," I said quickly, pointing toward the coffee kiosk where my mom was. He didn't even glance in her direction. "You sure? Because I saw you sitting here all alone. Why don't you come with me, and I'll help you find them?" I shook my head, standing up from the seat. "No, they'll be back any minute." His smile never faltered, but something about his eyes darkened. "Come on, kid. It'll just take a minute." That's when my mom returned. "Hey, sweetie, here's your..." She stopped mid-sentence, seeing the man standing there. "Who are you?" The man's smile faltered for a split second before he quickly said, "Oh, just trying to help." The boy looked lost. My mom's eyes narrowed. "He's fine. I'm his mother." The man took a step back, hands raised in mock surrender. No harm done, just looking out for him. He turned on his heel and walked away, quickly disappearing into the crowd. My mom didn't buy his act for a second. She grabbed me by the arm, dragging me toward the gate desk, where she immediately reported what had happened. The gate agents looked concerned and promised to call security. When security came, I gave the description of the man. But when they went to check the security footage, they saw him walking away from the gate. Then suddenly, he turned down a hallway that leads to a service entrance and seemingly attempted to leave the terminal that way. I'm not sure if they caught him or not, but I'm grateful my mom came back when she did. Flying wasn't something I enjoyed, but it came with the job. I had done it enough times to know the routine. Board, find your seat, maybe chat with the person next to you if they seemed friendly, then settle in for the long haul. I had flown enough to know what to expect. This flight was different. I was heading home from a work conference, tired, and just wanting to get back to my apartment. The flight was a red-eye, scheduled for nearly 5 hours, and I hoped I could sleep through most of it. I boarded the plane, found my window seat, and stuffed my carry-on into the overhead bin. The aisle seat was still empty when I sat down, and I prayed it would stay that way. Of course, it didn't. Just before the door closed, a man shuffled down the aisle, his eyes scanning the rows. He looked disheveled, like he'd been on the road for days. His hair was greasy and matted, his clothes rumpled and stained. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me. It was the way his eyes locked onto mine the moment he saw me. Great, I thought. Here we go. He dropped into the aisle seat with a heavy thud, his bag slung awkwardly over his shoulder. He didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk, which I was grateful for at first. I figured he'd put in his earbuds, maybe pass out for the flight, and we'd get through this without any weirdness. But then he turned toward me, and everything changed. "First time flying?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes uncomfortably wide as he leaned closer. I shook my head, trying to keep it brief. "Nope, done this a lot." "Good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means you won't panic when it happens." My stomach twisted at his words. "When what happens?" He didn't answer. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent a chill down my spine. I shifted in my seat, turning toward the window to avoid eye contact, hoping he'd get the hint and leave me alone. For the next few minutes, he said nothing, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was like he was watching me, studying me, and every time I glanced over, he was still staring. The plane took off, and I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the man next to me, waiting for him to do something, say something. The tension was unbearable. Finally, I put my book down and decided to close my eyes, hoping sleep would take over. But just as I was drifting off, I felt a hand brush against my arm. I jolted awake, my heart racing. The man was still sitting there, his hand just inches from mine, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Sorry," he muttered. "Didn't mean to startle you." But there was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. I pulled my arm closer, trying to put as much distance between us as possible in the cramped space. I glanced up at the flight attendants, wondering if I should ask to move, but the seatbelt sign was still on, and I didn't want to make a scene. That's when he spoke again, his voice so low I could barely hear it over the hum of the engines. "You ever wonder what it feels like when it happens?" I frowned, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You know, when the plane goes down." I froze. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his creepy smile never leaving his face. I've always wondered what people feel in those last moments. The fear, the panic. "You think you'd scream?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dude, that's not funny." "Oh, I'm not trying to be funny," he said, his tone calm, almost casual. "I've just thought about it a lot. The way people freak out when they know it's the end. You ever see the videos from the crashes? They scream and cry, but it doesn't stop what's coming." I was officially freaked out. I glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else was hearing this, but everyone seemed oblivious. I considered calling a flight attendant over, but the man wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, just talking. But it was the way he was talking, the calmness in his voice, the weird fascination with something so dark and terrifying. I shifted in my seat, putting as much space between us as I could. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but can you stop?" He didn't respond. He just smiled again, his eyes locking onto mine for what felt like an eternity. The rest of the flight was a nightmare. Every time I tried to relax, he'd shift closer, muttering something under his breath about crashes, disasters, or death. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything but the growing sense of dread in my stomach. When the plane finally touched down, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the aisle before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. I didn't care about the rules. I just needed to get away from him. I hurried off the plane, my heart still racing, and didn't stop until I was out of the terminal. As I left the airport, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. But he wasn't there. I never saw him again. But the memory of that flight stayed with me for years. It wasn't just the creepy things he said. It was the way he seemed to revel in the thought of something so horrific. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't just talking about crashes. He was thinking about doing something terrible himself. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be reminded when we post a new video every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email it to us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story featured in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.